What is up, my internet friends and family? I'm Charmix, and today I'm going to be reacting to 5 most horrific medieval torture methods and devices by top 5s. Now, I'm not really sure what to expect from this, but I assume it's going to be crazy. And with that being said, the original link's in the description, and let's begin!
Torture has been a horrific reality for many unfortunate people, and although some torture is still used in modern society, during the medieval times, torture was part of everyday life and considered a reasonable way to extract confessions, punish offenders, and perform executions. Different types of torture were used depending on the victim's crime, gender, and social status. Skilled torturers would use devices and instruments to prolong life as long as possible whilst inflicting the most agonizing pain. Many prisoners were tortured prior to execution in order to be ridden of additional information. So yeah, medieval times were pretty harsh, and here are 5 most brutal medieval torture methods ever used. When freely running around, rats are cute little rodents, but if you corner one, they turn very angry and distressed, and someone realised they could use cornered rats as a form of torture. This rat torture seemed to originate in China and was used widely throughout the UK, mainly in the Tower of London, where the abundance of rats from the River Thames made it one of the cheapest torture methods out there. The methods used varied from caging someone's head with a hungry rat inside so that the rat could feast on the victim's face, to locking criminals in the Tower of London dungeon and waiting for the flood of rats to wash in with the River Thames. But the most brutal use for these rodents involved strapping down a victim to a table. A rat was then placed on their stomach and covered with a metal container, usually a bucket. This would then be heated by a flame, and as the rat began to panic and look for a way out to escape the heat, well, escaping through the metal bucket wasn't an option, so you guessed it. Through the victim's stomach the rat would burrow, crawling through their skin and tearing up their internal organs. If they were lucky, the rat would get through their stomach in a few minutes, but unfortunately the process often took much longer, meaning the victim would be in excruciating pain for hours as the rat made its way through their belly, resulting in death either from the rat eventually chewing through a vital organ or from the horrific diseases and infections that would occur from the opened wound. The thought of being awake whilst the rat is basically eating you alive is truly disturbing and definitely one of the worst tortures out there. Sawn in half. Though a less common method of torture, it's easily one of the most brutal. Being sawn in half was used in the Middle Ages throughout Europe, ancient Rome, China, and the Middle East, as it was a cheap and easy method of execution, because all that was needed was a saw, 2 trees or posts, and the unlucky victim, and of course the executioner. Those who were accused of witchery, adultery, murder, blasphemy, or even theft were often sawn in half. They would be hung upside down with both legs tied to a tree or post, spreading their legs. Then they would be sawn with a large saw vertically in 2, starting from the crotch. What made this such a horrific torture method is the fact that as the victim was upside down, blood continued to flow to the brain, meaning they would remain alive for much of the process, and the loss of blood was a lot less significant, so death from blood loss wasn't such a luxury. Not only was this form of torture incredibly gruesome, it was also very humiliating for the victim, as they would be hung upside down, often completely naked and defenseless, and literally had to watch themselves be sawn in half.
That would be horrible.
But the victims wouldn't always be sawn completely in half. It wasn't uncommon for the executioner to only cut down to their abdomen, and then leave the victim to die, either from trauma or infection. And I don't know what would be worse, getting cut and left, or being completely cut in half. The rack, easily the most well-known torture device around, and there's a good reason for it. The rack was a torture device that was meant to not only cause severe physical damage, but also make its victim endure the maximum amount of pain and psychological trauma for those who were allowed to survive their interrogation. The design was fairly basic, a large rectangular wooden frame with a roller at one or sometimes both ends. The unfortunate person would be positioned on the frame with their arms and legs tied to the ropes that were attached to the rollers. Then, as the torture process began, the operator would slowly turn a handle that was attached to the rollers, stretching the victim's limbs from their sockets, snapping their muscles and ligaments.
Medieval
if the torturer kept turning the handle, slowly but surely the victim's arms and legs would be completely ripped out of their sockets. It goes without saying that this device wasn't intended to kill its occupant, but to completely disfigure their limbs into an unimaginable and unmendable mess. Those who were not executed after being subject to the rack would have suffered immensely, as no one would help them reposition their limbs. Most famously, Guy Fawkes was said to have been placed on the rack for his role in the Gunpowder Plot. Here is his signature before being subject to the rack, and here it is after. You can see the horrendous effects it must have had on him. As time went on, the rack's excruciating effects wasn't enough, and new, more gruesome designs started appearing. Spikes were added to the rack in order to penetrate the victim's back, and this would pull apart their spinal cord, and seeing how vulnerable and exposed the victim was just laying there naked on the rack, hot pokers and flames were often used to further punish the lawbreaker being stretched.
That is
Toe
messed
wedging.
up.
Now, if this one doesn't make your eyes water, then I don't know what will. Although this method actually dates back to ancient Egypt, it was extensively used during the medieval times. Toe wedging basically involved taking a wooden or metallic wedge and hammering it underneath the victim's nails. This method was often used on people suspected of witchcraft. The victim's feet would be fastened to a platform, then the interrogation would begin in order to extract information about the person. If they cooperated, they would be spared the torture, but those who failed to confess had the wedges forced underneath their nails. To prove how bad things were during medieval times, toe wedging was considered a sort of light torture to more painful torture methods if the victim did not confess after having all of their nails pried off.
It does seem kind of light
Although
compared
not
to the other
intended for
ones.
death, due to the fact the same wedges were often used on every victim, death from infection was not uncommon. Like the rack, this alone didn't seem to be enough pain to inflict, and another variant was often used. Instead of wedges, wooden or bone skewers would be dipped in boiling oil and driven under the toe and fingernails. The burning oil would incinerate the incredibly sensitive flesh under the nails, and once the nails started to pry, then they would be ripped out at the root with a pair of pliers. The head crusher. The head crusher was a brutal device. It was commonly used by the Spanish Inquisition, and it's exactly what it sounds like. If information needed to be extracted from someone, then their head would be placed in the head crushing device. With a metal bar under their chin and a metal cap over their head, the executioner would slowly turn a screw which would gradually compress the head between the bar and cap. At first, the victim's teeth were smashed and disintegrated into the jaw. Then the jaw would completely shatter, followed by the facial muscles and bones being crushed. If they still didn't want to confess their sins, the device would continue to crush their head until their brains would literally be destroyed. But this was by no means a quick way to die. The agony could last for several hours, as the torturer could prolong the session for as long as he wanted by tightening and untightening the device. And even those who were allowed to live, although still alive, often had irreversible brain damage and severe facial disfigurement. The most disgusting part about this torture, apart from the fact your skull would eventually be destroyed, is that after the victim's jaw would completely shatter, their eyes would literally pop from their sockets. And some devices even had containers in the front to catch the victim's eyes. And don't forget, the victim would still be breathing at this point. Surprisingly, this torture didn't stop after the medieval times, and in India and Persia, trained elephants were used to crush the heads of criminals, and this was
I think
used
I've heard of
well
that
into
before.
the 19th century.
Alright guys, hope you liked this video. This is messed up. Now, there is one on here that I think they really should have included, and I saw this method years ago when I went to a museum down, I don't know where the hell I was, but I went to a museum, and they had like a medieval torture area in it, because why not? And one of the torture devices was a barrel that was lined with nails. Like, they put nails in it so that they were inside of the barrel, and then they put a person inside of the barrel, and then they rolled them down the hill so that they'd be falling on top of the nails and shit. That sounds probably worse than the one with the putting the stuff through the nails. I mean, that sounds so much worse. But with that being said, I hope you guys liked this video, and if you did, give it a thumbs up, possibly share it with a friend. If you did, subscribe and join the family today, and if you're interested in any more reactions, check out my second channel, Charmix2, where I do some there, and I'll see you guys next time.